Dan here. I wanted to do a little talk about airlocks and aging sour beers. Now, before I begin, I'm going to say that probably I am overthinking all of this stuff, but I think that presenting it to you and my thought process behind it all might bring up some things that you may not have thought of before with aging sour beers and what airlock to use. There's quite a bit to think about, so let's get into it. So before we talk about airlocks, we have to first talk about fermenters. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on fermenters, but we have to talk about it a little bit. So historically, lambic brewers will age their beers in barrels. That's the way lambic is done, and some Flanders sour beers as well. So we know that barrels breathe. We know a lot about that from also the wine world. So barrels are porous, which means that oxygen can come in and out, or go in, and CO2 can come out. We also know that barrels lose a certain percentage of liquid. That's called the angel share. We know that a little bit of oxygen produces good results. We know this from the lambic brewers. So whatever levels of oxygen they're getting in their beer appears to be acceptable. It's giving good results most of the time. Not all the time. Sometimes barrels don't produce good beers for perhaps over-oxygenation issues. The question then kind of becomes how much oxygen is needed. Does it have to be the exact same amount of oxygen that barrels provide? I'll go in a little bit more on that. We do know that too much oxygen for sour beers is very bad. Brettanomyces can take that oxygen and create acetic acid, which is the more acidic acid than compared to lactic acid. It can have a little bit of a vinegar taste to it. And from the acetic acid, Brettanomyces can create ethyl acetate. Ethyl acetate is an ester that has a pretty high threshold taste, but when it's in very high concentrations, it smells like nail polish. In lower concentrations, it's kind of fruity, kind of a pineapple-y flavor. So in low amounts, it can be good. In high amounts, it's very bad. And both acetic acid and ethyl acetate are to be avoided in sour beers. Also, when it comes to barrels, most of the lambic breweries now top up their beer so there's not a lot of headspace. The more headspace that's in there, the more oxygen that's going to get into the barrel and expose the beer to oxygen. Back to the lower levels of oxygen that appear to be acceptable and good. We know that Brettanomyces can metabolize micro-oxygenation. That's what it's been called, micro-oxygenation. So it's very small amounts of oxygen that are getting into barrels. And Brettanomyces can metabolize that. They, unlike Saccharomyces, they don't die easily in a low pH environment. They stay active for the entire 2, 3, or more years, and they can help clean up the oxygen. Brett will form a pellicle if there's too much oxygen, or perhaps any oxygen. Now, I've had beers that didn't form a pellicle and had a lot more exposure to oxygen and had bad results. So when you get a pellicle, that's a good sign. It's going to help your beer. It's going to help protect the beer. And another thing to consider is Lactobacillus and Pediococcus don't get any benefit from oxygen. They don't like oxygen. They're anaerobic microbes. So oxygen is not needed for their metabolism. I just wanted to reiterate the ethyl acetate issue. Exposure to too much oxygen can create a nail polish aroma in the beer, which is really off-putting. I've been able to blend back a beer that I had ethyl acetate because of the high threshold of taste. And so far I've been okay on that. But Jay Goodwin, from the Rare Barrel, he dumped 4 barrels recently because of ethyl acetate. And in his experience, the ethyl acetate will come back if you try to blend it back. So I don't know if I would advise people to do that. Now, thankfully for us, the Rare Barrel doesn't dump very many barrels. because we love their beer, and it's definitely a tragedy when you have to dump your beer. So now let's talk about the homebrew fermenters. I don't have any barrels myself. I use better bottles, 6-gallon better bottles mostly. I've used glass a little bit. I've used buckets, not very frequently, but I have used a bucket. I just got a big mouth plastic fermenter, so I'm going to see how that goes. But the thing is, with these smaller vessels, there's more surface area. With more surface area, there's more risk when it comes to the exposure to oxygen. Sampling from the top of the fermenter also introduces, when you put a wine thief in, it introduces a lot of air. So you get a lot more oxygen exposure from that, even a lot more than any of the airlocks that, or fermenters, any of the rates of oxygen exposure that they're giving the beer. When you sample the beer, you're introducing a lot more oxygen. So I'd also like to talk about the kind of pseudo-myth of the CO2 layer protecting the beer. One of the ideal gas laws is often quoted as a reason why CO2 doesn't really form a layer that protects the beer. Beer and Wine Journal did a really extensive article on this from a scientific point of view, but in layman's terms that anybody can understand, and I recommend highly that you check it out. Basically, if carbon dioxide and oxygen are in the same container and at the same temperature, eventually the molecules will bounce off each other and the gases will mix. It doesn't take too long for that to happen. So the microoxidation that happens in your fermenters is not going to be protected against by the CO2 layer. Those molecules are going to mix, and the oxygen is going to get into the beer. Now, another issue is the breathing problem, which barrels suffer from, all fermenters suffer from. Basically, changes in temperature and atmospheric pressure create a vacuum inside of your fermenter. So when the temperature goes down, there is a vacuum that's created, and certain airlocks deal with that in certain ways. We'll go more into how different airlocks will be affected by that. But that vacuum can create suckback of oxygen or water that's in the airlock, things like that. Depending on your temperature difference, I don't know exactly what the temperature is. I think a lot of it depends on the atmospheric pressure as well, the weather. You may or may not be affected by that. Me personally, I'm affected by that because I have to age my beers in outside of my fermentation chamber. So, and I also live in a hot part of the world in Las Vegas, so I'm affected a lot by that, especially during the summertime. Just a quick note on buckets versus glass versus better bottles versus kegs. Buckets are a little bit more permeable to oxygen. A lot of people will say not to age your sour beer in buckets because of that. There's also the issue of the seal between the lid and the bucket not being complete. If it's not completely sealed, you're going to have a lot more oxygen getting in. For that, I would recommend not using old buckets if you are going to use a bucket. That said, on Basic Brewing Radio, Michael Tonsmeyer was interviewing sour beer brewers at NHC 2014, and one guy they interviewed aged his sour beers in buckets, and it was only for 8 or 9 months though. And Tonsmeyer himself sampled the beer, and it was very good. So it may still be doable, but most people will not age their sour beers in buckets. Better bottles are permeable to oxygen, but not much less than glass. They actually did a study on that, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Kegs obviously introduce the lowest amount of oxygen, perhaps none at all. Another thing that some people will do is use a cask breather on their fermenters. I've seen people do this, especially when they cold crash, like an IPA that they dry hop or something like that. They'll hook up a cask breather, which introduces a small amount of CO2 into the fermenter as they cold crash, because the cold crashing creates that vacuum effect. And with the CO2 going inside, it keeps the fermenter from collapsing on itself or having to deal with unhooking the system and then a bunch of oxygen coming into it. If you have a cask breather system and you're able to use it with your aging sour beers, that's excellent. I think that's probably not practical for most people, though. So one of the most highly quoted or read studies is a study by Better Bottle. They tested several different kinds of airlocks, including a 3-piece airlock with rubber or plastic. They also covered their patented airlock, their waterless one. I'll talk more about this later. And rubber bungs and things like that. So I'll put a link to that in the About section here. Highly recommend that you check that out. Basically, they found that rubber bungs were the best at keeping oxygen out. Now, the thing about rubber bungs, they work great for aging, say, an imperial stout or barley wine. However, with sour beers, there's a continued production of carbon dioxide. It can happen for 6 to 12 months as the Brettanomyces breaks down the higher chain sugars. So I've actually had a rubber bung pop off of one of my fermenters, and I was in the room at the time, so I heard it. But if I didn't, then I probably wouldn't have discovered that until perhaps it was too late and the beer was infected. Another often cited study is the one by Raj Apte. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right there, Raj Apte or Raj Apte. His study is quoted in Wild Brews by Jeff Sparrows, and he gives a table of different oxygen exposure over long periods of time. The Better Bottle study was only during 1 day, so it wasn't a long-term study. That's something to keep in mind. So a lot of the information that we have are based off of these 2 studies. I'm sure there's other studies out there. If you know of them, go ahead and link them in the comments, please. So now let's talk about airlocks. Raj Apte, who interestingly took down his information off of his website. He's a scientist. He wanted to find out what the actual oxygen rates are for barrels, and he wanted to figure out how to reproduce that in a homebrew setting. So he created the wooden dowel airlock. That's where they take a rubber bung, they drill a hole through it, kind of a thick hole, and a hole big enough to put a wooden stick basically through it, an oak one, and that was supposed to reproduce the amount of oxygen exposure that barrels would go through. Well, some people were having issues with that because the problem is that the wood can expand, and when it expands, if you're using glass, it can shatter your carboy, and people were having issues with that, cracking and shattering glass carboys. I think that might have been the reason why he took down the information. I'm not totally sure, but people have tried that. I would recommend if you do that, don't do it with glass. Do it with a plastic fermenter. But in my opinion, I think that's overkill, and I think it's unnecessary. One thing about oxygen exposure that we don't know a lot about is how much oxygen is actually needed. We know that in kegs and bottles, bottles do have some oxygen exposure, kegs have a lot less. But when under that pressure, Brettanomyces creates funky flavors. So the question that I have is, how much oxygen is really needed for the Brettanomyces in a secondary environment? I haven't gotten a good answer. I've asked the question on several forums, and nobody really seems to know the answer to it. So I always err on the side of caution and reducing the amount of oxygen as much as possible. I'm not worried about oxygen, micro-oxygenation for the Brettanomyces. I just don't think that it's really necessary. So now on to the next subject of airlocks, and that is just 3-piece and S airlocks, the regular old airlocks that we use. Now, I would recommend trying to use them with rubber. The rubber is less permeable to oxygen than plastic, according to the Better Bottle study. So, but there are differences between those 2 types of airlocks. Now, the 3-piece airlock, when it comes to the breathing issue, you'll get suckback of the liquid that's inside of the airlock. Some people, for that reason, will use vodka, which I recommend, especially for aging sour beers, because that liquid will actually get sucked into the airlock and into your fermenter. along with any air that will go through there. Now, when that air goes through it, the airlock, there's not actually a filter. I think the chances of getting dust in a bubble into the fermenter, it's possible, but a lot of people age their sour beers with 3-piece airlocks or S airlocks, and they don't have issues with Acetobacter infections. Acetobacter is in the air, travels on dust, and if it gets in your beer and there's oxygen present, it will turn the beer into vinegar. But the 3-piece airlocks do suffer from suckback of liquid as well as the oxygen. And I think about at least a 10-degree temperature difference will cause that, Fahrenheit. Now the S airlocks, they don't have the issue of sucking back the liquid. So instead they'll just suck back the oxygen back into the fermenter. Now some people don't worry about that. Fair enough. I think that one of the things to consider is that let me back up a little bit. In a 3-piece airlock, when you have suckback, the water might be filled to the line. After the suckback happens, it will be greatly reduced to about halfway to the line. When that happens, you know that you're getting suckback. Now, in an S airlock, you never really know it unless you happen to be there and hear the bubbling. So that's one advantage of using the 3-piece versus the S airlock. Again, I would recommend using vodka though in the 3-piece airlock. Jamil Zainasheff talks about using the red carboy cappers and filling up your fermenter as high as possible to the neck. It's an interesting way of doing it. I think it's not the only way of doing it. So the red carboy stoppers are very permeable to oxygen, very leaky. So what he does is he fills up the fermenter as much as possible to the neck so that there's as little surface area as possible. That's one way of doing things, not the way that I recommend. Also, according to the Better Bottle study, there are those silicone waterless airlocks. Silicone is very permeable to oxygen. It's one of the reasons why it's used, for example, to make contact lenses. So I would avoid any kind of silicone airlock. Finally, we have the Better Bottle airlock. This is the PET O-ring enclosure. It has a black O-ring here that seals very tightly on a Better Bottle. The cap here will come out. And according to their studies, there's another O-ring on this. And according to their studies, this is just about as good as a rubber stopper. But again, since sour beers continually produce carbon dioxide, this may not be the best idea, although it's a lot more tight than a rubber bung when it comes to a Better Bottle. These only fit on Better Bottles. They do not fit on other plastic carboys. Now, this little thing also is sold by Better Bottle, and this is called the Dry Trap, and it fits inside of the O-ring closure. But you're going to have the black O-ring on it. So this thing has a ball, a steel ball in it that allows air to come out but not to come back in. I've seen some people use this, like Tony Yates, for cold crashing. It works really well for sour beers. The downside of these things is that this is about $25 and this is also about $25. This is a $50 airlock. A little bit overkill, very expensive. I don't know why they're so expensive. I don't think they cost that much to make. But they do let in a lot less oxygen than the other kinds of airlocks. Another thing to note about these is that the sites that sell them are a little bit misleading. They'll have a picture of both of these together and say that's $25. They're actually only selling this piece and not that piece. So shame on some of the homebrew stores that are partially falsely advertising. So do be aware that you have to buy both pieces of this, and it's going to come to about $50. Now on these, I don't know exactly how much oxygen they are keeping out. There is some oxygen being sucked through this device. So this might be a little bit overkill. I do use them myself, but they are probably a little bit on the overkill side. You really don't have to use them. The reason why I use them, though, is because yes, the amount of oxygen that you introduce when you sample is a lot more than any of the airlocks that we talked about. However, it's an accumulative thing, so if your airlock is really leaky and you're also sampling the beer, it's going to add up, and you can possibly get the nail polish effect. And if you're getting nail polish effect in your sour beers, then this might be something you want to visit. So in conclusion, there's actually a lot to think about when it comes to airlocks and aging sour beers. There's some different issues there that are different from clean beers, such as the constant CO2 production, the negative effects of oxygen exposure can be worse in sour beers than in clean beers. But in the end, keep your airlocks full. At least be aware of suckback issues. If you get nail polish issues, then think about how much suckback might be occurring for you. See if maybe you can go with a cask breather or one of these expensive better bottle caps or airlocks. But in the end, relax, don't worry, have a home brew, and good luck aging your sour beers. Cheers.